What if a family's very blood carried a secret too heavy for time to erase? What if an ordinary house, its doors closed, its fields silent, was not simply a home, but a vessel for a curse passed from one generation to the next? Welcome to Gothic Ledger. Before we begin, I want to know something from you. Write down in the comments the time and location where you are watching this from. It tells us where our story is reaching and when. And while you're here, don't forget to subscribe and like this video. It helps us bring more of these hidden histories into the light. Tonight's account does not begin with a crime scene or a single tragedy. It begins with a family whose name itself became a warning, whispered in census margins, in church pews, and in the records of institutions that rarely explain themselves. Theirs is not a tale of ghosts or superstition, but of something colder. An illness recorded in files, studied in laboratories, and buried in obituaries that named only the dates, never the cause. And so, as we turn to their story, one question lingers. Was this a family marked by chance misfortune, or by a design written deep within their blood? The farmhouse stood at the bend of Copper Creek Road, where the pavement surrendered to gravel, and the mail came every other day, if the weather allowed. Clad in weathered clapboard and roofed in corrugated tin that lifted slightly in wind, it sat back from the ditch line behind a barbed fence and two leaning tobacco barns. The fields around it were cut into long rows, soil dark with last year's burley, the air in summer holding the faint tannic sweetness of curing leaf. From the front steps one could see the creek in winter, but by June the sycamores hid it, and the house became a sound, hammering, chickens, a tractor that did not idle correctly, more than a sight. On paper, the Traylors appeared as many families did then, one household, 2 adults, 12 children, ages laddered neatly across a decade and a half. Their names filled a census form in a tight, looping hand. The parish roll listed them on 2 lines to save space. The county ledger recorded a small property, modest yields, taxes paid late but paid. Poverty was not spectacle here. It was a narrowing of choices, patched knees, flour sacks recut into aprons, a pantry built on what the fields allowed. Religion arranged the days. Mornings opened with scripture read aloud at the kitchen table. King James balanced between a coffee tin and a salt shaker. Sundays were spent on worn pews beneath a framed print of a lamb and a shepherd. Wednesdays meant revival if the roads were passable. The children learned to bow their heads and keep their hands still. In photographs, few, dim, and slightly blurred, they stand in 2 ranks, hair combed, expressions set, the father's palm resting on a boy's shoulder, not as affection, but instruction. Neighbors called the property haunted ground, though not for ghosts. The term was descriptive shorthand for a place where oddness accumulated without cause or remedy. Chickens sometimes effused the roost. A calf was found one year at the fence line, perfectly still as if listening for something beyond the pasture. Windows broke and were taped before they could be reglazed. At night, a light would burn in the kitchen long after the fields had gone quiet. These were not events, only fragments, witnessed but not spoken of, added to the private arithmetic of a community that measured distance as caution. The house ran on discipline. Children rose before dawn, divided by task and season. Water hauled from the spring, kindling split, rows hoed, leaves looped on sticks for the barn. Meals were simple, and the table a narrow court. Hands washed, heads bowed, voices kept to a register that did not provoke remark. The mother maintained order as economy. Beds made, floors swept, shirts scrubbed on a board until the knuckles paled. Noise was permitted only when it was useful. Bucket, axe, gate chain, and even then the children learned to recognize the threshold beyond which usefulness turned to attention. Money was counted privately at night, the father's back to the window, the mother's pencil shifting figures from one margin to another, the numbers stubborn no matter how she moved them. Charity offered through the church plate was declined with thanks, then accepted later as a bag of flour or a sack of potatoes left on the porch by someone who did not knock. The family did not borrow and did not explain. When questions were asked about the eldest working less in the fields, about the third child who had started sleeping in the barn, about the girl who could be seen standing for long minutes at the edge of the creek, the answers were courteous and unhelpful. From the road the house read as ordinary, a porch with a swing that rarely swung, a yard raked in concentric arcs, a line of wash that mapped the family by size. Only at certain hours did its edges sharpen. In late afternoon, when the sun pressed through the west windows, a thin brightness traced the seams of the clapboard, as if showing where the structure had been joined and where it might give. On storm nights, the barn doors shuddered in a rhythm that made the dogs uneasy. And sometimes, less often than memory would later suggest, but enough to be recorded, an ambulance turned at the mailbox and crawled the lane with its siren unlit. No one in 1972 would have called the Traylors a study. They were a family at distance from town, working a small acreage on land that did not favour sentiment. Yet even then, the record had begun to cohere. Census lines, parish notations, a school nurse's report misfiled under another child's name, a deputy's note about a window broken from the inside. Ordinary facts, placed side by side, make a different shape. The neighbours felt it before the forms confirmed it, and so the phrase persisted, haunted ground, not as folklore, but as a caution against the things a house can hold. In time, officials would ask for signatures and vials would be labelled with dates and numbers that did not include the family name. The creek would keep running, and the tobacco would cure, and the porch paint would lift in strips. And the farmhouse at Copper Creek, built to shelter labour and prayer, would become, without announcement, more than a home. Its rooms the first pages of a hereditary file that no one in the house had intended to open. The Traylor name was never entirely clean in county memory. Long before the breakdowns of the 1970s, it had already been traced in margins of records, a surname accompanied by a small pause, a tilt of the voice. In census tables from 1910 and 1920, two brothers were listed as inmate rather than farmer or labourer. Their location shifted to an asylum 2 counties over. The parish ledgers, more discreet but no less telling, noted in delicate ink ill health of mind, beside a cousin's name, later crossed out and rewritten as departed. In whispered recollection, there were uncles who never came back from state hospitals, cousins who were said to wander off and whose absence was left unexplained. The details were vague, but the consistency of the pattern gave the surname its weight. A child-born Traylor was marked by association. In back pews, elders repeated the phrase that never reached a sermon, that bloodline is haunted. Poverty and rural isolation worked as accomplices. Families who struggled to keep their land had little reason to announce weakness. When a son stopped working the rows and began speaking to shadows, the explanation was phrased as nerves or tired blood. When a daughter stood too long at the well, gazing as if at someone unseen, it was explained as absent-mindedness. No one asked further. Questions did not fix harvests nor prevent gossip. Superstition threaded through these omissions. In small valleys, mental illness was often folded into the language of curses. The old-timers spoke of fields gone barren after ploughs struck stones marked with strange stains, or of children who sickened because their families had taken timber from land that was not meant to be cut. The Traylors, stern and religious, rejected such explanations publicly, but silence itself became a superstition. If spoken of less, perhaps it would not grow. Generational poverty ensured the cycle had little resistance. With no money for doctors, what could not be endured was hidden, and what could not be hidden was sent away. The state hospitals, those brick institutions built on outskirts, became repositories for bloodlines deemed unfit for the rhythms of rural life. The Traylors' relatives joined those populations in a way the community remembered but never recorded in detail. By the time the 1970s brought visible breakdowns within the farmhouse at Copper Creek, the reputation was already sealed. Neighbors would remark in low tones that the signs were always there. The uncles who disappeared, the cousins who drifted out of the census, the girls who never married because no one would risk the inheritance, all of it became a background murmur, a long preparation for tragedy. Thus the name itself became a quiet warning. Spoken at a schoolhouse roll call or listed on a marriage license, it carried with it not just a family, but an unspoken history of nervous disorders, unexplained vanishings, and rooms left vacant in brick asylums far from Copper Creek. The Traylors lived with this knowledge folded into their daily survival, the sense that their lineage was not entirely their own, but marked by something inherited, whether by blood, by silence, or by the superstition of neighbors who already believed the land itself remembered. The first entry under the Traylor name in the State Hospital Archive is dated autumn of 1972. The handwriting is careful, the phrasing detached, as if the pen itself knew to keep distance. Male, 19, rural origin, no prior history. Beneath it, a single phrase repeated in two different hands. Auditory phenomena. Caleb Traylor, eldest son of 12, had been laboring in the family's tobacco fields when he began to insist that voices were following him between the rows. At first he claimed they were whispers rising from the soil, then that they drifted behind him in the wind. His mother called it exhaustion. His father struck him, believing discipline would chase away nonsense, but within weeks the voices became commands. Neighbors later recalled the smoke rising from the Traylor barn one October evening. Caleb had been found there with a lantern tipped to dry hay, muttering that he had to burn it before the figures inside took form. His younger brothers dragged him out. Furniture in the farmhouse had already been smashed in days prior, chairs splintered, crockery reduced to fragments, his rage delivered without target, but with frightening precision. The county sheriff, summoned reluctantly, arrived with 2 deputies. The report listed the cause as fit of madness, a phrase repeated often in rural filings. He was transported eastward by state car to Eastern State Hospital in Lexington, a facility whose red brick halls had absorbed generations of similar names. The intake sheet listed symptoms clinically: paranoid ideation, auditory hallucinations, property destruction, arson attempt. No mention of tobacco rows, no acknowledgement of voices carried in the wind. The document closed with a routine observation. Patient appears agitated, restless, prognosis guarded. For the Traylors, the explanation was reduced further still. In their telling, Caleb had suffered a fit, nothing more, a temporary storm in a boy otherwise raised right. No pastor sermonized it. No neighbor asked questions aloud. The family returned to its work as though one son had been mislaid, but not lost. Yet in the county's collective memory, that year marked the beginning. Caleb was the first to vanish from the farmhouse into institutional care, but the quiet certainty grew that he would not be the last. The ledger of their bloodline, already filled with whispers, had now acquired its first official page of diagnosis. The Traylor records did not stop with Caleb. Within a decade, 3 more names from the same household were entered into county files, each breakdown distinct, each echoing the first. The second entry came only 2 years after Caleb's removal. His younger brother, Samuel, aged 16, began retreating into silence. Teachers described him as once lively, but gradually he ceased speaking in class, then at home, then entirely. By the time he was evaluated, his responses were limited to brief nods, and he sat for hours without movement. The hospital chart listed catatonic presentation, voluntary mutism, selective withdrawal. To his family, it was another spell. The third case carried violence into the open. In 1977, Joseph Traylor, then 18, lashed out during a school lesson, attacking a teacher without warning. Witnesses recalled his sudden eruption, a chair lifted and thrown, followed by incoherent shouting about being watched. Police detained him, and the file recorded paranoid ideation, violent outburst, danger to others. Joseph was removed under state order, admitted under security watch. In town, the incident was barely spoken of, referred to simply as the trouble at the school. The fourth entry in the sequence belonged not to a son, but a daughter. Rebecca, age 21, was discovered by neighbors standing in a shallow creek near the family property. She remained there for hours, unblinking, soaked and unresponsive, as if awaiting something unseen. When brought home, she neither explained nor acknowledged the episode. The official record noted dissociative fugue, psychotic features, prolonged catatonia. Her admission followed quietly, with little discussion in church or community. Each case bore its own signature, yet together they traced an unmistakable pattern. Caleb with fire and voices, Samuel with silence, Joseph with rage, Rebecca with stillness. 4 children removed, all carrying the same family name, all marked in clinical notes with the language of disintegration. Inside the Traylor household, the recognition was unspoken. The parents called it fits, spells, or afflictions, words chosen carefully to avoid permanence. Their neighbors whispered of the haunted bloodline, though never to their faces. The family themselves refused to link the cases aloud, as if naming the pattern would give it more power. In state files, the pattern was already taking form. Parallel notations of paranoia, hallucination, mutism, catatonia. In parish records, however, nothing changed. Attendance was marked, hymns were sung, the Traylors bowed their heads like all others. But the silence that hung in their home grew heavier with each removal, until the ordinary farmhouse stood less as a dwelling and more as a waiting room, for the next name to be added. The Traylor family's struggle did not end at the hospital gates. Once their children were removed to eastern state or placed in county facilities, new burdens arrived, bills, whispers, and the constant erosion of reputation. In county ledgers, the charges appeared in precise figures: ambulance fees, admission costs, medication lists. Antipsychotics, such as Thorazine and Haldol, were itemized, renewed monthly, and billed directly to the family. With no insurance and little steady income beyond seasonal tobacco harvests, the Traylors were forced into cycles of debt they could never repay. Creditors called, notices arrived, but each was tucked into drawers, hidden beneath church newsletters and seed catalogues. Inside the parish, silence became its own currency. Neighbors leaned closer during sermons, whispering about the 4 siblings gone up to Lexington. Each mention of the Traylor name carried a shadow, though never spoken aloud to their faces. Pews left empty on Sunday told their own story. Father Gallagher, the local priest, recorded in one margin note, "Family distressed, children absent, troubles not for public ear." Within the house itself, secrecy hardened into discipline. Mrs. Traylor, iron-willed and immaculate in her Sunday dress, instructed the younger children never to mention their brothers and sister outside the home. They were not to say mad or crazy. Instead, they used gentler words: fits, spells, troubles. In private, she ran the house like an armed guard, ensuring that no visitor saw overturned furniture or heard midnight screaming. Poverty denied them any choice but the state. Private clinics in Louisville or Cincinnati were never options. Therapy was unheard of. Doctors were strangers. What they had instead were overcrowded wards, barred windows, and locked doors. Each admission deepened their dependence on institutions they feared but could not avoid. Secrecy became a form of survival. To admit too much would bring more scrutiny, perhaps the county taking the remaining children or the church turning them away entirely. So they polished the silver, folded the hymnals, and spoke of nothing. The farmhouse at Copper Creek stood as both refuge and cell, its walls holding in the younger children, its silence shielding the family from the town's pity and scorn. What remained unspoken was heavy enough to bend every floorboard, the knowledge that the curse might not be finished. The Traylor name, whispered in town, was written differently inside the walls of Eastern State Hospital. There it appeared in folders stamped with codes, accession numbers, and marginalia that would never reach the family's hands. In one memorandum from 1974, a superintendent referred to them not by name, but as a unique cohort for hereditary observation. From that point forward, their charts were no longer simple medical files. They became data sets. Staff were instructed to record not only delusions, but also family placement, birth order, and shared behaviors. What began as case notes slowly evolved into research logs. Blood was drawn often, far more than treatment alone would require. Vials traveled quietly from the asylum to laboratories in Lexington and Louisville, marked not with names but with initials and dates. A nurse's margin note survives, patient agitated at repeated phlebotomy, procedure explained as necessary for study. No further explanation was ever offered, neither to the patient whose arm was pierced, nor to the family whose signature allowed it. The records speak with a chilling detachment. Patient T3, male, 23 years old. Auditory hallucinations persistent. Cohort study indicates onset consistent with siblings. 3 cubic centimeters of blood drawn. Stored. Patient T6, female, 19. Catatonic. Nonverbal. Consider genetic correlation. Blood stored. The words are sparse, unembellished, yet they reveal the quiet shift. These men and women were no longer simply patients under care. They had become specimens. Their lives, their bodies were treated as keys to a hidden riddle. The Traylors were not only a family in decline, they had become a living archive of disordered blood. Hospital files show entire siblings reduced to data points, aggression coded as A, withdrawal as W, mutism as M. The files stacked higher each year, but no letter of explanation was ever mailed back to Copper Creek. No mother was told her children's blood was being frozen for future analysis. No father was told the institution had quietly reclassified his family as a resource for science. The horror was not in what was said, but in what remained unsaid. To the Traylors, the hospital was a place of locks and sedatives. To the doctors, it was a laboratory disguised as a ward. And in that silence, the family became less than patients. They became evidence, sealed in files, indexed, studied, and never returned. The remaining Traylor children, the ones never committed, never medicated, lived inside a shadow more suffocating than any locked ward. They were healthy only by exclusion. No psychiatrist ever wrote their names in the cohort files. No chart bore their blood type. But each of them grew into adulthood carrying the same unspoken expectation that illness would arrive tomorrow. Every lapse in concentration became a warning, a misplaced object, a forgotten name, a night of restless pacing. Each was quietly catalogued as evidence. They learned to conceal their watchfulness, but in the privacy of their minds, every ordinary fear was recast as prodrome. They were not diagnosed, yet they rehearsed their own diagnosis daily. The language of the house shaped them. Words like fit, spell, and attack floated through their childhood, attaching themselves to memory. Silence became strategy. If they confessed to hearing a noise no one else heard, or to feeling strange, they feared they, too, would be sent to Lexington. And so they stayed quiet, allowing their anxiety to calcify beneath the surface. Survivor's guilt became the common inheritance. They lived with the knowledge that 4 siblings had been removed, marked, and studied, while they remained behind. The contrast carved fractures within them, relief mingled with shame, and shame deepened into suspicion. Why were they spared, and for how long? The youngest spoke later of scanning their own reflections, watching for the change in eyes, the slackening of expression, the first signs of withdrawal. The older ones buried themselves in routine, work, marriage, distance from Copper Creek, but distance never dismantled the fear. They carried it across counties and decades, an invisible file stamped above their heads. Psychiatric literature calls this anticipatory anxiety. In the Traylors, it hardened into identity. They grew not into lives of ordinary adulthood, but into lives shaped by vigilance. They were not patients, but they lived as if the hospital door was always within reach. Thus the family split into two halves, the afflicted, who were silenced by wards and sedatives, and the healthy, who lived outside, silenced by fear of joining them. Neither half escaped. One was contained by locks, the other by expectation, and together they proved the cruelest truth of hereditary illness, that survival does not mean freedom. It only means waiting. In the record of the Traylor family, the mother stands as both anchor and architect of silence. Her children's names appear again and again in hospital charts, but her own name is scrawled in margins, the visitor who would not relent. She walked the miles when money was too thin for bus fare, arriving at wards with parcels of cornbread and jars of beans, refusing to let institutional diets define her children's care. She argued with physicians, resisted the easy prescription of electroshock, and insisted that her sons and daughters be seen as more than numbers in a study. In the waiting rooms, she was described as unyielding. Yet in the house on Copper Creek, her will took another form. Younger siblings were forbidden to mention the names of those who had been committed. To speak them aloud was to risk contagion, of gossip, of fear, of fate. The silence became law, a doctrine stronger than any sermon. She dictated order through denial, keeping the home polished, the meals punctual, the Bible always open on the table. Her contradictions form a profile of divided loyalty. In the hospitals, she was the tireless defender, unwilling to surrender a child to the machinery of treatment. At home, she became the censor, erasing those same children from memory so the family could continue to function. To the outside world, she appeared a model of maternal duty. Inside, she ruled with absence, an insistence that collapse was never spoken of, never named. Psychiatrists of the era would have labeled her schizophrenogenic, the cold mother who incubated madness. The term, now discredited, clings to her like residue. She was not the cause, but her vigilance and control etched themselves into every surviving child. They grew beneath her doctrine, love expressed in food carried across counties, silence imposed like scripture at home. Her life can be read as a balancing act, each gesture or of devotion countered by a demand for secrecy, each act of resistance offset by an insistence on control. A house of cards, kept upright only by forbidding any breath that might shake it. In this, she is remembered less as a figure of cruelty than as a figure of paradox. A mother who carried food in her arms and silence in her mouth. A guardian who fought against the institutions, but built her own institution of fear inside the farmhouse walls. The file reads like any other clinical report, blood drawn, coded, and stored. Yet behind those sterile lines lay the private anguish of a family who never consented to become a dataset. By the early 1980s, the Traylors' medical records had moved quietly from state hospitals into national research programs. Their blood samples, taken during routine admissions and preserved in government freezers, were anonymized but flagged. Notes referred to them not by name, but as a large hereditary cohort. In this language, their suffering was stripped of context and converted into evidence. To the researchers, the family represented opportunity. In the decades when psychiatric genetics was struggling to move beyond speculation, the Traylors offered a rare concentration of illness within a single bloodline. Their vials were logged beside thousands of others, yet annotated with subtle marks of interest: multiplex pedigree, high penetrance. The margins speak in acronyms, chemical notations, and clipped phrases, cold in tone but pointed in meaning. Among these files appear early references to synaptic gene irregularities, mutations resembling what would later be named SHANK2. The handwriting betrays neither certainty nor conclusion. Instead, it lists probabilities, conditional phrases, possible linkage, uncertain expression, incomplete concordance. The researchers glimpsed a pattern, but one blurred by the presence of healthy siblings whose blood carried the same anomaly without visible decline. The Traylors themselves remained unaware. No one informed them their blood was stored in laboratories far from Copper Creek, or that their names circulated in coded form at conferences. Their family history became raw material for a science still years from coherence. What was intimate, shameful, and silenced at the farmhouse became, in academic halls, a case study without voice. By the end of the decade, findings were shared among committees, published in guarded language, and absorbed into the broader pursuit of psychiatric genetics. The Traylors' contribution was never acknowledged, their lives reduced to variables in an unfinished equation. For them, there was only the reality of sons and daughters lost to institutions and the quiet dread of those who remained. For the researchers, there was advancement, a data set to refine hypotheses, a step closer to mapping the architecture of schizophrenia. But for the family, there was nothing. No answers, no relief, only the same silence that had always governed their lives. The horror of the discovery lay not in what was found, but in what was withheld. A blueprint for madness was glimpsed in their blood, yet no explanation was ever carried back to the home on Copper Creek. The closing record reads less like history than like absence. 4 of the Traylor children died within asylum walls, their names omitted or reduced to initials in local obituaries. Their passing marked not with remembrance, but with erasure. No cause was listed beyond the perfunctory natural causes, though each had lived decades within state care. Those who survived carried the surname like a burden. Several changed it outright. Marriages hastened, paperwork altered, family ties dissolved. In parish rolls, the line of Traylors thins abruptly, as if the bloodline itself sought concealment. To escape the shadow of madness was to abandon the name entirely. The farmhouse at Copper Creek still stands, though weathered into anonymity. To the eye, it is only another relic of Kentucky tobacco country. Sagging roof lines, soil exhausted by decades of cultivation. Yet to neighbors, it remains marked ground. Children are told not to linger near its fence posts. Adults lower their voices when recalling it. No apparition haunts its halls. No legend of ghosts circulates. The house's burden is heavier, an inheritance of blood. In the archives of state hospitals, the Traylors persist under case numbers, laboratory codes, and misfiled charts. Their samples continue to sit in freezers, their histories folded into medical journals that never carried their names. They exist as fragments, a reference in a genetic study, an anonymized statistic in a report on hereditary illness. The community remembers differently. They say the madness did not arrive at Copper Creek as an affliction from outside. It lived there, quiet, inherited, sealed into silence. The Traylor family became both an object of science and a cautionary tale, studied yet never understood. And so their legacy endures, not in monuments or memorials, but in whispers and in files. A family fractured, a line obscured, and a farmhouse regarded as cursed. The story of Copper Creek closes like a patient chart, incomplete, inconclusive, suspended between silence and study. For the Traylors were never only victims nor only subjects. They were both at once a family and a warning. The records close where they began, on a quiet house in rural Kentucky, its fields grown over, its walls emptied of voices. 4 Traylors died in state care, unnamed in the papers. Others shed their surname, leaving only silence behind them. Yet the blood they carried still rests in hospital archives, coded, catalogued, but never truly explained. The legacy of Copper Creek is not one of haunting, it is one of inheritance. Madness did not arrive at their door, it was written into them, waiting, and it remains unanswered still. If you have stayed with us until the end, thank you. Now, I ask you to leave a trace of your own in the ledger. Write down in the comments the time and place you are watching this from. And if you found this story as chilling as we did, remember to subscribe and like this video. It helps us continue uncovering what history tried to bury. This was Gothic Ledger. Another file closed, another silence preserved.